Hey guys, I'm Ben, and today I want to talk about one of my own personal favorite guitarists. He's right up there with John McLaughlin and Larry Coryell and guys like that who I absolutely love, and that is, of course, Mr. Allan Holdsworth. The great innovator, the unique genius of the guitar, kind of an enigma, an unusual guy in many ways. In other ways, very personable, very friendly guy, but also very determined, very headstrong, very much uncompromising when it came to his musical vision and his desire to create a unique musical statement. He didn't like people copying him. If he found out people were copying his licks, he wouldn't play those licks anymore, or he would try to avoid them at all costs. And he was very critical, self-critical of his own musical output. You know, whenever he was asked in interviews about his older albums and stuff like that, he would quite often be quite disparaging or apologetic almost of letting people down or something, you know. And I've heard quite a lot of stories of people who met Allan at gigs that he had played, and when they congratulated him on his amazing performance, he would be, "Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't very good tonight," kind of thing, so very self-deprecating, very it's interesting because it almost seems like he doesn't have confidence in what he's doing, but at the same time, and this is kind of the interesting contradiction, is that, he's so wedded to his musical vision. And so there obviously was a confidence there. There was a confidence in the concept, I think, more than the execution. I think he had a strong concept of what he wanted to do and was perhaps frustrated by in his own opinion, ability to pull off that concept, where for the rest of us, we were all kind of just amazed. Those who get it anyway. Allan is certainly I don't know if divisive figure is the right way of putting it, but it tends to be like people either love or hate his playing. And I think that's pretty understandable. It's pretty understandable. A lot of people who are not musicians don't get it, it's certainly not easy listening music. Allan's music is certainly not for the faint of heart, and it's certainly not for the unadventurous. It's certainly not for the kind of people who want their music to be relatively safe and predictable. Anyway, let's have a little bit of a look at Allan and his life and his albums. I won't look at every single album that he was a part of because there's quite a lot. But we'll have a look at this sort of through trajectory of the albums that I think really sort of pushed his career forward and that sort of either left a mark, were highly influential, or were milestone points in his career. So Allan was, I've got some notes here that I made earlier. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm referring to. So I'll just go through some of his history and some of the albums. Let's get into it. I already said that. You don't need to hear me fucking repeat myself. Allan was born in 1946 in Bradford, England, and he grew up in Yorkshire. His father was a jazz pianist and trumpeter, so Allan was exposed very early on to great bebop and modern jazz, especially guys like Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, of course. All these legends were on high rotation on the Holdsworth, stereo.
My father was a really great musician. He was a pianist, and he studied classical music, and he was a big jazz fan. So he had all of these records. I loved it, and I couldn't understand why I'd listen to something and I'd start feeling like I wanted to cry, and I was like going, what's going on here? Then he'd play something else, I'd feel kind of happy or whatever, and then I just got all these feelings from music, and so it was many, many years later when I started becoming interested in wanting to play a horn, a saxophone, because I started listening to a lot of saxophones because there was a lot of saxophones on his records. But saxophones were pretty expensive back then, so I ended up with a guitar, and all I did was stand in front of the mirror with it, pretending I was Elvis Presley or something,
He originally wanted to be a sax player, I guess, to follow in the footsteps of those horn players. But the sax at that time, I guess, was too expensive, and a guitar was purchased instead. And I always think, thank God for that. Although it would have been interesting to see if Allan would have been as revolutionary a player if he had taken up the sax. I imagine he would have, because that musical spirit is just oozing out of everything Allan does, So I'm sure if it's interesting, like modern players who sort of do fusion, they draw much more from Allan Holdsworth's version of fusion guitar playing than from like John McLaughlin or Al Di Meola. And that sort of approach is much more, it seems to have lasted much more, just like guys like Michael Brecker, like everybody who plays saxophone these days, or after Michael Brecker kind of does the Michael Brecker approach. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. Holdsworth, he didn't learn guitar in the normal rock and blues kind of way that most people kind of went about it in that period of time. He really approached it much more like a horn player. He was thinking more in intervals, chord movement, voice leadings, rather than just scales or licks. This really led to his revolutionary legato technique, his wide interval leaps, and his non-standard chord voicings, which would really be distinctive trademarks of his playing. Throughout his career, Allan really struggled financially and artistically. He really, as I said, he really hated compromises. He really disliked the business side of music very much, and often quit high-profile bands when he felt musically constrained. And, despite this, or perhaps because of it, he became one of the most revered musicians in history, meaning, for the regular public, for the musicians out there, their guitar heroes are like Slash and all the sort of more like famous David Gilmour, this kind of thing, right? Who are great, they're fine, they're good at what they do. But for musicians, our guy's Allan Holdsworth in many cases, So in 1969, Allan would be part of the band Igginbottom's Ranch, and they would put out their, I guess, sort of self-titled album, Igginbottom, in 1969. don't know what the deal is with that name. It sounds like, I don't know if that's a British joke or if that's the name of a town or something. I don't know. But anyway, it sounds very British. This album would be like much more in that sort of blues rock, early Zeppelin, Cream kind of vibe, more so than, you know, any kind of fusion or anything like that he would sort of later be known for. It's interesting that Allan actually later disowned this album and refused royalties because he was really embarrassed by the stylistic limitations.
What was the first record you made? Was it the Tempest thing? Or
Yeah, I did some things before that, but I'm not going to admit to any of them. So to me, the first album I did was Tempest. I'm going to stick to that.
If you listen to the album and, you know, when Allan's playing, it is, you can hear that he's still developing his thing, but it's there. It's the thing. He's still distinctive. He's still, even in this very early very early stage, is already distinctively Allan, in my opinion, anyway. Interesting album. Not one that I go back to very often, and it's not one that I own on vinyl. But yeah, at some point, obviously, I would like to get everything that he's been a part of just to be a completist. But it's not a priority. Next is Tempest, self-titled album Tempest from 1973. Tempest was John Heisman on drums, who would, of course, be famous for his band Colosseum and Colosseum 2. I'm not really that well familiar with Colosseum. I mean, I have listened to a little bit of it, and I wasn't that grabbed by it, but I'm a big fan of Colosseum 2. He's a great drummer, John Heisman, very cool. That was Allan Holdsworth and Mike Clark finishing out the Tempest band there. And later on, Ollie Halsall, the other another great English guitarist, would join Tempest as well. And for a brief period of time, they would actually be Allan Holdsworth and Ollie Halsall playing together. And the live BBC from 1973 recording highlights this, and it's really, really cool. Like, it's interesting because Allan didn't really like playing with another guitarist. He didn't want, and it's one of the reasons he left the band. He didn't want to be sharing guitar duties. But when you hear that live recording, there's so much fiery trading going off between the two of them, and there's very few guitarists who can hold their own against Allan I almost combined their names. Allan Holdsworth, and there's very few guitarists who can hold their own with Holdsworth, and Ollie was definitely one of them. He's a great guitarist, and I haven't really heard much of anything else that he's done. But on that Tempest recording, wow, he's really incredible, and it's similar. He's doing similar things with his legato playing and similar approach. So they actually really very complementary of each other, and at times it's a little hard to tell who's playing what. But definitely worth checking out. That the first album, it's like, here I've got written progressive rock debut with jazz tendencies, but I actually think of it more like In Rock by Deep Purple, like if it was a prog band, you know, like it's kind of proggy Deep Purple or something like that. Paul Williams is also singing on the Tempest album, this Tempest album and the live album. And they did another album, but I'm pretty sure Allan's not on that one, and I don't think Paul's on that one either. But anyway, Paul Williams would rekindle his connection with Allan on the early solo albums, which is really cool. But that's where they first performed together, was in Tempest. And it's really interesting. It's for me, I feel like it's like I said, it's kind of like Deep Purple, but like a bit more proggy. But and also one of the really interesting sort of innovations, I guess, that John Heisman pushed was that he really did encourage extended improvisation, which was kind of rare in prog rock at that time. So everything was usually much more composed, like long compositions, through compositions. But John Heisman was sort of bringing in that sort of jazz improvisational element into the prog as well. So you got all of that in there. That all said, I don't think the songwriting is not on par with Deep Purple or something like that. It's like the songs it's more like vehicles for some great instrumental playing, I think. But yeah, still very cool though. Definitely worth checking out, and definitely worth having. You know, I think they're very cool albums. Maybe not quite earth-shattering albums, but very, very good. Definitely very good. Allan would go on to do a whole swag of fusion albums, and really sort of make a name for himself in that jazz fusion world. Yeah, I also forgot to mention that in 1972, I think it was, he also worked with one of the most important early fusion bands in Britain, which was in England, which was Nucleus. Although the album that he was on was Belladonna under the name of Ian Carr. And Ian Carr, of course, is the driving force of Nucleus. And it's essentially a Nucleus album. Yeah, Allan is on that, and it's really great as well. Although I don't think it's like that important as far as necessarily the the career trajectory, so to speak. An album that really is much more important and that also is connected to Nucleus is, of course, Soft Machine and the album Bundles. This was really a big shift in a way for Soft Machine, because they'd never really had the guitar as the lead voice, and then all of a sudden you've got Allan Holdsworth, who's this monster as your lead voice, and so it makes that album really stick out like a sore thumb in their catalog. The solo that Allan does on the song Hazard Profile is one of the greatest fusion guitar performances ever recorded, I think. It's absolutely incredible. Fantastic stuff. It really it goes on and on and on and on, and it's just like, I mean, it's just mind bending. And it's interesting. It's like I can see why people who art musicians might find that a little bit too much, you know, a little bit too, like, you know, critics will always call that kind of thing overindulgent and stupid phrases like that, you know, and it's self-congratulatory, overindulgent, it's guitar wankery, and like I just think that's complete and utter horse shit. You know, it's just those critics never could understand music. You know, most of them aren't musically trained, and they don't know what the hell they're talking about. You know, most of them would rather listen to like Lou Reed or Bob Dylan or something like that, which is fine. You know, whatever floats your boat. But like, if that's what you're into poetry, and you studied journalism at school, don't try and like tell us what good music is. Anyway, don't get me started on that. This was really, I think, the album that you could say introduced Holdsworth to jazz audiences, you know, and really made a lot of people sort of stand up and take notice. One of those people, of course, was the master drummer himself, Mr. Tony Williams. And so Tony Williams would get Allan to come over to the States and join his band, the new Tony Williams Lifetime, and record the album Believe It in 1975.
I was working with Tony Williams. I came over to play with Tony, which was obviously one of the highlights of my life, to work with such great musicians. And that's how I met Alan Pasqua, you know, unbelievable, and Tony Newton. So it was a great thing for me, but it financially fell apart, you know, and we kind of ended up getting stranded in San Francisco, and I sold my guitar to get back home. And then
here you had Tony Williams, Allan Holdsworth on guitar, Alan Pasqua on keyboards, and Tony Newton on bass. And they created this incredible high-energy fusion with brutal rhythmic intensity. Just absolutely mind-blowing stuff. Again, more incredible guitar playing from Allan. A little interesting story is that Tony reportedly loved Holdsworth's playing, but found his harmonic ideas so advanced that they sometimes clashed with the band's funk rock direction. So, you know, that would have been a interesting fly on the wall kind of situation to see how that played out. But of course, the finished product stands for itself. It's an incredible album. I don't have it on vinyl, unfortunately. I had it on CD back in the day, but I got to get my hands on that. Really, really smoking stuff. And I know a lot of people who would regard that album as the greatest thing Allan ever did. A lot of people love Allan's sideman work in the 70s more than any of his solo albums. And I was in that category as well for many, many years. I think I had the same problem that a lot of people have, and that I didn't really get Allan. I didn't really understand what the hell he was doing, and I was judging it with the wrong from the wrong perspectives or something. And also, I think like sometimes you to understand certain types of music, you have to sort of develop your own musical skills, and your ear has to develop, and it takes time sometimes to really grasp something that's high concept and unique and different, and that might be even a bit uncomfortable at first. And I think that's the case with Allan. Like, you know, for a lot of people, it's his solo albums just are too impenetrable, you know. But yeah, we'll get to that. Allan would do another album with Tony called $1 Million Legs in 1976. This was a much more commercial leaning album. Not as much improvisation and but still, there's some great solos there and everything. But as an album, it's not one I go back to very often, to be honest. I think it's a bit flawed, and especially as a follow up to the incredible Believe It, So, and what's really interesting is that like Allan was following in the footsteps of my other favorite guitarist, John McLaughlin, who was in the original Lifetime with Tony Williams. And so it's just like I love these little connections that you get, in this period, especially in this period of time. With a lot of my favorite musicians, there's a lot of cross-pollination, which is really cool. Also in 1976, he would do an album that I think is far better than $1 Million Legs, and that is, of course, Pierre Moulin's Gong and the album Gazeuse.
I had a manager at that time called Nicholas Powell, and he was one of Richard Branson's partners in the Virgin thing. And he introduced me to these guys, Gong. He said, "Well, we should try putting a guitar in this band." And so I went and played with them, and I enjoyed it. It was really great. I mean, they were good players. It was interesting, really interesting. 2 vibraphones. Drums, bass, guitar. It was a nice combination, and it was really good. What I remember about that band, no offense to any other guys, was that after a while, if they'd get going, like the French, they could kind of maybe seem like a good argument or something. They get into these ferocious arguments, and it would all be in French, and I couldn't speak French. So I just that would be my time that I could just leave and go to the pub, and they'd be all going at it. Hopefully it'd be all over when I got back. But it was a good experience.
And
so Gong is a really interesting, and that's a whole nother video that we can do. But at this point in Gong's trajectory, David Allan had left, and Steve Hillage had left, and the band was now under the control of the incredible drummer and percussionist Pierre Moulin. And he, along with his brother Hanford Rowe on bass and the great Allan Holdsworth on guitar, produced this album Gazeuse, which I think means espresso in French, but don't quote me on that. I don't speak French, so I don't know. That's just what I've heard. Really interesting album. Really interesting to hear Allan in this format, because here he's not able to do the same kind of interesting chordal stuff that he normally does. Here he's playing modally, and yet it's still very Allan. He's still able to be extremely recognizable, and his characteristic voice is very much all over this thing, and it's really fantastic stuff. Really elegant, melodic fusion. It's a little bit lighter and more lyrical than Lifetime, but equally compelling. I might even like this album more than the Lifetime album. The Lifetime album is not one of my favorites from Allan. I'm kind of, I guess, an outlier. I actually like the Soft Machine more. I even like the Ian Carr more. I like this more. I like the next album I'm about to talk about. Yeah, but that being said, it's all great. Some people say that this is like Allan Holdsworth's most beautiful fusion playing, and that might be true, but I don't know. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. There's plenty of beautiful. I think everything he plays is beautiful. I think people misunderstand it. They sort of just hear all this this sort of all these millions of notes coming at you at a million miles an hour, and from weird angles, and it's really like in a way that you've never really heard anybody play before, and it just sort of sounds a bit like disconcerting. But once you understand what he's doing, I think everything he plays sounds really beautiful. I think his whole thing is beauty and love. It comes through in his playing, and that's what I love about Allan. That's why I love him so much, because I feel that now when I listen to him play guitar. It doesn't really matter whether it's fusion, whether it's like kind of the weird I.O.U, like demented rock kind of thing that he was doing on like Metal Fatigue, or like just the full-blown atmospheric sort of chordal adventures, any of that, like it's just full of love. Another album that is full of love and that is absolutely beautiful, in my opinion, and from another absolute master of that 70s jazz rock genre, one of my favorite guys, Jean-Luc Ponty, and his album Enigmatic Ocean from 1977.
My hookup with Jean-Luc was after I played with Tony Williams. Apparently he heard the recordings that I'd made with Tony, and through his manager, Michael Davenport, at that time, he found me somehow and asked me if I'd like to come over and do this album with him, which was the Enigmatic Ocean record. And I did that. Obviously it was a great pleasure and an honor to do that, because he's a really amazing musician, and I really, really like him as a guy. I mean, he was just very nice to me. So, it's always nice to work with people who are really nice to you. I've had too many Buddy Rich stories, huh?
That's very true.
Are you digging it? Yeah, I'm digging it. Dig it all you want. It's your last night.
Jean-Luc Ponty, of course, on violin. You got Allan Holdsworth on guitar, Daryl Stuermer on guitar, who's also a great guitarist. And what's really interesting is hearing those two play off each other, because unlike his combination with Ollie Hassel, who kind of plays in a similar way, they're completely different. And yet Daryl Stuermer is a great guitarist as well, and he does hold his own. He's much closer to, the Hendrixy fusion, and he has that a really different approach. But it really, I think it gives the album even more colors because it is different, because it does give you a whole nother perspective. So it's very cool. You've got the great underrated bass player Ralph Armstrong on bass. I love his playing. He played on my favorite album of all time, The Visions of the Emerald Beyond by Mahavishnu Orchestra. Excellent. And the great Steve Smith on drums. Fantastic lineup. This is a fusion masterpiece. It was a successful album. It reached a broad audience. And, this is another album that helped Allan really, get a global name and really become much more well-known, especially among musicians. Next, Allan would join up with the progressive supergroup UK, which of course was Allan on guitar, John Wetton, the great John Wetton from King Crimson on vocals, Bill Bruford also from King Crimson and Yes, and Eddie Jobson on keyboards and violin. And this is a really you know, that first UK album is a fantastic album. Prog rock with, like, you know, jazz sophistication, really forward thinking, really cool, great songwriting. Allan, of course, playing up a storm, beautiful stuff. A lot of people rate this as one of the best things or one of their favorite things from Allan, because it is a bit more, you know, like if you're a rock guy, this is probably the best album for you to check out, because it's, you know, proper songs. It's more sort of rock focused. I think probably one of the easiest albums to digest from Allan's catalog, and it's very, very good. It's high quality stuff. I really love it. I've got it on vinyl over there as well. You know, it's interesting to think this band is one of those examples of Allan not compromising, you know, and it being something that is at the same time something that you can respect and admire in him, but also, you know, you can't help but think like it was also a detriment to his success and career, you know. And UK did very well. They were gaining. They were on the precipice of becoming a really huge band. They were selling records. But Allan, his whole thing is improvisation. You know, he's obsessed with improvisation. He doesn't want to be playing the same solo every night on tour. And this was the problem, is that, you know, Eddie wanted him to, and I think John Wetton as well, wanted him to play, you know, the guitar solos, you know, especially like In the Dead of Night, which was their sort of big song from that album, to play the solos exactly like how they are on the album. And that's not how Allan plays. You know, Allan's all about improvisation. He didn't want to do that. And Allan's not really that much of a rock guy, really. Like he dabbles in it, but that's not where his heart lies. And so that didn't continue. You know, that UK was bound to not last. And it's disappointing in a way, because, like, just for Allan's sake, you know, because Allan never really made any big bucks, and in fact, towards the end of his life, he was in a pretty bad condition financially, and which is really sad to think about, that a genius like him had to struggle. But this wouldn't be the first or only time that he would kind of destroy his commercial chances in the name of musical integrity. So yeah, like I said, you got to kind of respect it in a way, but also think, you know, what could have been. Anyway, so when he left, he would then hook up with Bill Bruford, who also left, and to do his own solo thing. Bill was ready at that point to do some solo records. And so he brought Allan in on Feels Good to Me in 1978. And also you have Dave Stewart in there as well, the great keyboard player Dave Stewart, and the incredible bass player Jeff Berlin as well, who's a controversial figure, but we can get into that another time. But I really like his playing very much. This was more a return to the jazz fusion, and it was, you know, like jazz fusion infused very much with Bill Bruford's totally unique and very cool approach to drumming. And Allan's all over it as well, smoking as well. Great stuff. They had the singer, the female singer on there again. What was her name? Oh, that's gonna bug me. Hang on a second. Annette Peacock, of course. Duh. So anyway, yeah, Annette Peacock, and she sings on a couple of the tracks, and it makes it really. I remember when I first heard that album, I kind of hated when she sang. Actually, I didn't hear that album first. I heard the what was it? Something about Goes to College or something. The live performance they did. Anyway, and so Annette Peacock performs there as well. And I don't know, maybe just in the mix of it live, cringe. And I didn't know who she was either. I didn't know that she's a very interesting artist in her own right as well. Anyway, but the album version of it, I was like, that's because the way it's mixed, it's like she's really upfront and in your face, and it's almost like done like that on purpose to really sort of shock your senses, I think. And it's really cool. I think it's really cool. Great album. Then, of course, they would follow that up in 1979 with the even better One of a Kind, which is the same band, except they didn't have Annette Peacock in there anymore, just all instrumentals. And I think most people would say that that's the better album, although I think they're both equally pretty damn good. I love them both. But it was around this point that Allan decided that it's... what's interesting, what I missed here, is in 1976, Allan tried to do his first solo album, and that would be the sessions for what would later be called Velvet Darkness. So yeah, this one, yeah. So you got Alan Pasqua, and you've got Narada Michael Walden on drums, and Alphonse Johnson, and of course Alan. It's actually an amazing album. It's an amazing, amazing album, but it's not a proper album because it was basically, they did the sessions, right? They did these sessions, and there's all sorts of folklore about this album, but basically Alan hates that album. He from Alan's point of view, he doesn't consider that one of his albums. And when they released the box set of his albums, which I almost fell off there, which I've got here, the box set. This is really cool. It's not in there. The solo album is he didn't consider that his first solo album. He didn't consider that an album. And the record label, CTI, put it out against his wishes. And they called it Velvet Darkness, and they did all the artwork, and they named the songs and everything like that. And Alan, I think, said that it was like they were rehearsals that were recorded. They weren't actual takes that were being recorded. They were just recording the rehearsals, and that's what was released. If you listen to it though, like there's multi-tracked parts and stuff like that. It's a little hard to believe. It's a little hard to believe that Alan wasn't aware that this is the session, But let's take him at his word. And Alan hated that album. He disavowed that album. And so therefore it's not considered, canonically part of his solo albums. But it's incredible. It's an incredible album. The band is awesome. I mean, when you've got like Alphonse Johnson and Narada Michael Walden and Alan Pasqua as your backing band, it's going to be amazing. I mean, those guys are all those guys are all amazing. And Allan was amazing too. So definitely worth checking out. I know that Allan hated it, and I sort of feel bad in a way to promote anything that he hated. But he hated hated a lot of his own music. So, if we went by that rule, we wouldn't listen to any of his music probably. So at this point, Allan is really over the whole sideman gig chapter of his life, and a number of factors have led to that point. Of course, his frustration in UK, and to some smaller extent in Bruford, the way the albums were put together, specifically in Bruford, he commented on how, what did he call it, like jigsaw music or puzzle music or something, like just the older multi-tracking of everything and then sort of piecing it together, using whatever best take, the producers or whoever was in control of the session decided, and sort of piecing together albums that way, which is, of course, is extremely common. A lot of bands do that all the time, and today probably more so than ever. And Allan, of course, would do that too later on, but at this stage he was kind of wanting a lot more spontaneity. The fact that he was sort of under pressure to perform in a way that was outside of his musical vision. And another factor that lit a fire under Allan's, proverbial rear end was the fact that in 1979, when he was at Ronnie Scott's, the great venue in England, he saw Gary Husband, the phenomenal Gary Husband, playing the drums. Gary Husband, of course, is the great virtuoso of drums and piano, one of the sort of rare examples of, someone who is equally virtuosic on both instruments, and has had, I don't know if like numerically equal amount of a career on both instruments, but certainly made an equal impression on both instruments throughout his career in very important situations with very important musicians and his own music. So Allan, when he saw, at the gig, he went and talked to Gary and asked him if he wanted to have a jam. And so they did, and immediately they had this fantastic chemistry. And, Gary Allan said something along the lines of, that the way Gary approached the drums was that he was so connected to it that he felt like, if he was a drummer, that's how he would play to his music, So they had that sort of almost telepathic connection there.
But that's just after that, I guess I just kind of started getting the urge to have my own band, and I had all this backlog of music, and I just wanted to do that. And then I ran into Gary Husband. I met Gary Husband, and that was it. And when I played with that guy, it was game over. I was going, I want to play with that guy.
And straight away, Allan knew that I want to make music with this guy, like do my own thing with this guy. And it was a match made in heaven. Gary's approach to drumming is absolutely phenomenal. He's one of my favorite drummers. I love his constant invention, which is what Allan was sort of seeking out. And that's the way he plays as well. It's like this constant invention, constantly searching. And also Gary's power, there's some fusion drummers, they just have this power about the way they approach the drums. Like Narada Michael Walden is another one. They have the ability to have so much finesse and focus, but also with a ton of power. And I just love that. I'm also, as you can see from my shirt, I'm also a lover of metal and rock and all of that stuff. So I like my fusion to have a bit of fire in it as well. And Gary certainly provides the fire big time, and especially on I.O.U. That album is absolutely incredible. They would also spend a fair bit of time searching for a bass player to come on and, round out the lineup. And eventually, after a long search, they found Paul Carmichael, who was really a perfect fit for this band. Kind of somewhat more understated than some of the bass players that were to come, but seemed to fit perfectly in this version of the band. This sort of, I think this version of Allan's band in its infancy was the most sort of wild, and I don't know what's the right word for it. It had a sort of edge to it that perhaps got a little bit smoothed out as time went on. It's still present in the next couple of albums, but on I.O.U. it's just, there's a rawness there, and there's a sort of wild abandon as well going on that fit. And I think it's because the tracks were performed live on the in the recording sessions. It really gives this sort of immediate energy to the music that's so compelling. I absolutely love it. And what's interesting about Paul Carmichael is that he also played with Ian Carr, just like Allan had played with him on the Belladonna album. Paul Williams was brought in after, one of those chance encounters on the street one day. Allan was walking through the town, and across the road there he sees his old buddy Paul Williams from their Tempest days. Paul Williams, of course, from Tempest. And, Allan wanted to bring in a singer for this project, and was, again, like the bass player, was really having a hard time, deciding who he could trust to handle that kind of material, someone that he knew that he could work with. So it was kind of like a chance encounter that he would bump into him on the street that day. And, after reconnecting, Paul got the gig, and Paul was happy to come on board. They would do a whole bunch of gigging under like a bunch of different names, like False Alarms and Handlebars, and really, just absolutely struggling. They were financially totally in the red, and in many cases they had to pay to play at gigs. I know I've had to do that as well in the past. It sucks. It's definitely not fun, and that's where the name I.O.U. actually comes from for this band, was the fact that, they were having to write IOUs to the venue owners in some cases.
But then, so we did, and then we couldn't get arrested. We couldn't get a gig. That's how we came up with the name I.O.U., because it used to cost us to play. How much do you want for us to come and play your place? Yeah. And I'm not kidding, that's how it was. But
that's so funny. I didn't know that.
I.O.U., how much do you want? Can we play your place?
Anyway, they would head to the Grand Union Canal in Little Venice, London, which is the location of the Barge recording studio, which was owned by Richard Branson of Virgin Records. And that's where they would lay down the tracks for the I.O.U. record. Had 5 overnight sessions to record the album, and you got to picture this. The Barge was this tiny kind of space, and it's on the water and it's very cramped inside. They only had like a fairly small room to put all the, put the band in. So you had, the drums in the center of the room. You've got Allan squashed in the corner, and you've got Paul Carmichael's bass amp stuffed in the toilet, the little boat toilet there on the barge. They did a fantastic job under those circumstances over 5 overnight sessions. Rumor has it, and I'm not 100% sure about this story, I've heard it from a few secondhand sources, although I did see Gary Husband talk about it a little bit as well, that the whole album was actually recorded, I think, in the first few sessions, and somehow the tapes were either lost or recorded over, or nobody was sure. I can't remember the details of that story, so maybe you can let me know in the comments. Basically, they had to re-record the whole album. Not basically, literally. They had to re-record the whole album from scratch. And apparently the version of the first version of the album was, like, according to Gary Husband, who I saw talking about it, the first version of the album was amazing. And he recently put out a new album of his past, going through his whole career, sort of material that he'd been a part of. And one or two of the tracks on there is from possibly one of the lost recordings from that session. So that's really interesting to check out as well. Andy Lewin was the engineer who also worked with the great Steve Hillage. I'll be doing a video about Steve Hillage for sure. I love his stuff. And XTC, amongst others. And, he did a great job with the band, despite all the tough conditions, despite the limitations, despite the setbacks and the financial issues and all of the stress and all of the shit that was going on. Allan and the guys they knew they had something magical. They knew they were doing something very unique and very new, and they really wanted to deliver, and deliver they did. And for my money, I.O.U. is the best Allan Holdsworth album. It's my favorite. I think it's the album that has the most of what I want from a fusion album, which is the feeling of spontaneity, of rawness, of power, of adventurousness, and for breaking new ground. And before I.O.U. came out, there was really nothing that sounded like that. Allan created something completely new. His approach, his chordal approach, his soloing technique had evolved since the 70s albums. Everything, his whole sound had changed. If you listen to, the drumming and the bass playing, but specifically like the drumming, Gary's never playing like a straight beat on that thing. Like, it's never just like a straight rhythm. It's constantly changing. Every bar, it's different. It's changing, it's modulating, he's taking it places, and that's the way Allan wanted. He wanted this perpetual invention, this never-ending inventiveness and creativity, and to take it into places that just nobody else was playing like that. And it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible album. And, it's interesting. A lot of people find that this is the point where things get divisive for them with Allan, that they find that he just, for a number of reasons, they find it a little bit too find it, what's the word I was saying, impalatable? Is that a word? Not palatable? Maybe it's because it was just too much. It's too complex. It's too out there. Like I said, that constant, it's never settled. It's constantly moving. Even when you think it's settled, if you listen to the drums, next time you listen to that album, pay attention to the drum. Any of his albums, really, pay attention to the drums. They're constantly changing. Also, another thing that people complain about is the vocals from Paul Williams. I know I've seen people like, Danny from Marvin talk about like how he loves Allan Holdsworth, but he hates the vocals on those albums. And I've seen other people, like most people who are fans of Allan Holdsworth, complain about the vocals. And I feel completely the opposite way about it. Actually, the albums with the vocals are my favorite albums of his, because I feel like on those albums, he's really tapping into something he's using the vocals to push it even further out into completely new territory, because you sort of listen to those albums and you're like, what am I actually listening to? What is this music? Like, where can you put it? Is it jazz rock? Is it sort of experimental art rock, or like, is it, A.O.R.? It's really bizarre. But I actually really like the vocal performance from Paul Williams. I think is better than his Tempest vocal performances. I really like it. I think he suits the music beautifully. I think it gives the music a whole nother color range, and it makes the solos and the instrumental sections feel more impactful. Yeah, I love it. I love Paul being in there, but I know just from friends and watching people online, and plenty of people have a problem with those vocals. So I get that. And I can understand, because it is weird. And I have to admit that, for a long time, the 70s stuff was where it was at for me, for Allan. And I sort of ignored, all this stuff right here. Ugh, this big heavy beast, right? All these great albums. There's I.O.U. there. I think like many things, the best music and the most interesting music sometimes takes a little while to get your ears in for it. And I think that's very much the case with Allan's solo albums. The band would keep going, and after the album was finished, they would try to get a record deal, and nobody would take it. They were even at the point where they were so desperate that they were telling record labels, you guys can keep all the profits, just put it out. Still no one would take it. And this, of course, was extremely disheartening for the guys, Allan especially, but for all of them, because they knew they had something special here. They would play gigs, and, there's the famous sort of story of them playing one venue there in England where they started playing, and the venue owner came rushing up to the stage and told them, guys, what are you doing? Stop messing around. The people have already arrived. The punters are here, and thinking that their fusion genius was them practicing and noodling around before the set began, which would have been incredibly frustrating for Allan. Just the thought of that makes me just oh my God. But Allan would have a vacation out to, I think, San Francisco in the States. And I think it was Paul Williams' wife, perhaps, who had some connections out there and told Allan, don't give up. Come out here, bring the band out here to the States, and I'm sure I can get you some gigs, and I can get things going for you. And so that's what they did. They headed out to the United States. And, Allan had quite a underground following out there that he was completely unaware of. Guys like Mike Varney and stuff had been promoting his stuff through the 70s, and or from the 70s, and there was a underground fan base that adored Allan's playing and would buy anything that had his name on it. And Allan was really unaware of the fact that he'd been in guitar magazines, featured and stuff like that over there, that he had no idea about. So it was quite a pleasant surprise for him. Anyway, so the band came out there and they played, and they got this woman, I can't remember her name, but I'm pretty sure she's the wife of Paul, got him a gig at the Roxy, where for example, Zappa did the Roxy and Elsewhere, album. And they played to a sold out room, so after playing to 15 people back home in England, and, being told that they need to start playing the songs and not noodling around like they, when they're in the middle of their set, all of a sudden they're playing to proper, several hundred people in a proper venue. And so, that was great. Anyway, so they did quite a number of gigs like that. And eventually, one of Allan's fans, who also happens to be a guitar god in his own right, and that is Mr. Eddie Van Halen, was at... Oh, sorry, it wasn't then. Eddie actually finally got to see Allan play live when they were when he was in UK, and he was supporting the UK was supporting Van Halen on that tour. And Eddie would stand on the side of the stage, like mouth like that, and like almost in tears, watching Allan play these mind-bending solos to a Van Halen audience that couldn't give a shit. But the one man who could give a shit was Eddie Van Halen, and he really loved Allan's playing, so much so that it had affected the way Eddie approached guitar. And Eddie, some of the tapping things that Eddie had made famous was because of him trying to emulate some of Allan's technique, but he'd never seen him actually play, so he thought some of the things that he was doing with his left hand, he thought that Allan was tapping, but it wasn't. It was Allan's different technique. But anyway, so they eventually hook up. They become friends. There's even a time, I don't know if it was more than once, but I know for sure at least one time when Eddie came up on stage and played with Allan. There's some photos of that, and they became friends. And when Eddie found out about how difficult the whole process of the I.O.U. album was for Allan and all the shit that he'd gone through, he wanted to really help his new friend and his guitar idol. He really loved Allan's guitar playing, and so he hooked him up with Ted Templeman, the producer of Van Halen, and I think he worked at Warner Brothers as well, right? And he wanted to get him to sign Allan to Warner Brothers. So Ted came out, watched Allan play, was blown away by Allan, didn't really like the band, and didn't really like Allan's music. He thought he was the most amazing soloist that he'd ever seen, but didn't think that Allan knew how to write a song to save his life. And yet he decided to sign Allan and get them, I think, a 3-record deal or something like that. Anyway, that led up to Road Games, which was the next album. And this is where some of the, problems started to really, manifest themselves for Allan's career. So when they had the first production meeting for the album, which included Ted Templeman and some of the executives from Warner Brothers, Allan Holdsworth, and I think maybe even Eddie was there, although I'm not sure, that's when the problems really started to occur. And Allan realized that the vision that Ted and the others, including Eddie, had for the album was completely different from what he wanted to do. And it's very likely, you can just imagine what's happened here. Eddie has recognized that Allan is the great genius guitar player that he is. He's an incredible technician of the instrument. And I think a lot of people just see Allan that way. But what they miss, and I think what Eddie missed, and I think obviously what Ted missed, is that Allan's genius is not just in his technical playing. There's plenty of technical players who are very, very good and who can do all sorts of things as well. Just, you know, that are incredibly fast, or, you know, like that can, you know, impress the crowds and all of that sort of stuff. Allan's genius is, yes, he's a great technician, but he's a great creative force as well, and he's creating something that's completely unique. As we saw with I.O.U, there was nothing like that. And I think what happened is that Ted and Eddie and Warner Brothers wanted Allan to channel his technical abilities into more of a marketable rock record. You know, something, maybe even something in the ballpark of Van Halen, you know, or something that you could be played on MTV, no problems, you know. And Allan wasn't having it. He wasn't having any of it. I'll also mention at this point, of course, the British guys in the band all were having a hard time staying out there in the US, and eventually had to go home. So Allan was forced to reconstitute the band with new members, and so he brought in his old buddy from the Bruford sessions, Jeff Berlin, on the bass, who was a great match for him. You know, easily one of the greats of that period of time. Fantastic bass player, a big fan of his. He's a controversial figure, but that's an issue for another video, I guess. But I love his playing. I love Jeff Berlin's playing, and he's great. And he would bring in the, I think like one of the only drummers that can fill Gary Husband's shoes is someone like Chad Wackerman, who is also a genius drummer, and absolutely love his playing as well, like almost as much as Gary Husband's. And the thing that's so great about Chad is that he can do that same constant invention thing, that perpetual invention thing, and he absolutely nails it, and would become a featured member of Allan's bands going forward. And Allan would play on his records in the future as well. And he's just such a great musician, you know, of course, famous for playing with Frank Zappa, another one of my heroes. Just incredible stuff. So,
well, that happened because we all lived in England. The whole band was English, and Paul Williams was living in California. He was married to an American girl, so they lived in Tustin, you know. So when we first came over, we were all kind of hanging out at Paul's house. So then we did a lot of gigs. You know, we got a gig at the Keystone Clubs in San Francisco, and the people who own the Keystone Club booked us up there for one night through Mike Varney, who was a big fan, and Mike Varney was instrumental in getting us our first gigs in California. He would contact all these clubs and say, I know you've never heard of these guys, but I'll guarantee you that you'll do pretty good business. So we went, and they were kind of really, really happy with what happened, because we went from playing these pubs in London to like 10 people to like 250 to 500 people in a small club, which is to us, it was like huge, you know. So, and then each one of these the club owners would call another club owner. That club owner called the guy at Roxy, and he said, I know you've never heard of these guys, but give them a gig, and the same thing. So I went, well, maybe I don't want to go home. But, so what happened is, basically I stayed there, and Gary and Paul went back to England. Paul Carmichael, the bass player. And then I went through this kind of semi-horrendous setup with Warner Brothers, which Eddie Van Halen, who's a wonderful guy, and he was really, really nice guy, great player, and he set us up with the people at Warner Brothers, and he got us a deal. But unbeknownst to me, they really didn't want me to do what I wanted to do, but I really didn't know that at the time. You know, it came later. So that's how Chad and Jeff came into the picture, because they were here. You know, so
this was the core of the band. One of the issues that Ted had was that he didn't really like Paul Williams' vocals, but Paul and his wife had been instrumental in sort of helping Allan in his dire situation when they first came over to the States. And Allan liked Paul. He liked it. He liked his approach. He liked him in the band, and he wanted him to sing on the record. But Ted didn't want him. He didn't like his approach, and didn't. I don't know what his problem was. I don't know that, but I'm just guessing that maybe Paul was like, if you see some of these videos of them playing live, Paul was a little bit daggy on stage. He didn't have that rock star vibe about him. He's a good singer, great singer and everything, and he fit the music perfectly. But image-wise, and this was coming into the age of image in rock, especially into the 80s. The birth of MTV had changed the game. So image was important, especially from the point of view of someone like Ted Templeman. Ted wanted to bring in somebody new on the vocals. Of course, this was really pissing off Allan. Eventually, they brought in Jack Bruce of Cream, and the great Jack Bruce, and he sang on one of the tracks. And he was supposed to sing on all of the tracks that had vocals, but apparently, Allan actually brought in Paul and did some behind the back of Ted. They recorded Paul on one of I think on the title track, Road Games, maybe, or I don't know. I could be wrong about that. Can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, everything was it was supposed to be a full album, but things just got so shitty and everything that eventually Ted lost all interest in the album, and Warner Brothers lost all interest in the album and dealing with Allan, and Allan's, from their point of view, perceived stubbornness and unwillingness to compromise or do anything else. Allan absolutely hated, he apparently, there was times when he was forced to play his solos over the phone to Ted, and Ted would tell him redo that or do this, and Allan hated all of that. He just hated having anybody interfere with his vision, especially after he'd been so free to do what he wanted to do on I.O.U. All of that being said, Road Games is incredible. It's another one of those albums that Allan hates. In many interviews I've seen over the years, he would criticize it. Although he would say that, of course, the playing of the band is very good and everything like that. But he personally hated the whole experience. So for him, he doesn't like that album. Probably the worst album cover in human history on there as well. And I guess this is one of those examples of Allan choosing his artistic integrity over commercial success. And, this is the second time he's kind of done that, because he did that with UK, and now he's done that here with his own album, which, what the hell is that? People in this neighborhood, they just come blasting the most horrible music out in the streets, out of their cars all the time. It's so fucking annoying. Anyway, Allan had the chance to, think about it. He had lined up Warner Brothers, Ted Templeman, and Eddie Van Halen. Oh yeah, and I think Ted and Eddie had the idea to bring in a whole bunch of famous guest musicians into the album, and I think really, rock it up. And Allan was having none of that. And, I think in a way I can really respect Allan for doing that and his, maintaining his musical vision. But just imagine if he'd done that album and it had been a big success, even if it was only one album that was like that, right? And that made him a lot of money. Then he would have had the financial freedom to do all the rest of it without having to stress and suffer for the rest of his life. And in the later years, that's exactly how it was for him. Anyway, he would move on. I think for the next album, he got out of that deal. They ended that deal. They Warner Brothers didn't want it, and I think Allan didn't want it either. Anyway, he moved on, and in 1985, they would release an album which to many people is their favorites, especially those from more of the rock side of things, or the metal side of things, and that is, of course, 1985's Metal Fatigue. Here again, Paul Williams is back on vocals, and he's singing all the vocal tracks. This is like, you know, you can sort of see there's a progression here from I.O.U. to Road Games, where it's like the sound gets sort of a little bit more refined and perfected. Allan's playing is immaculate, and then you get to Metal Fatigue, and it's like the extra step again. And this one's so important. It's such a great album. I don't know much trivia about this album, just that it is one of the fan favorites. It is one of the milestones. It's one of my personal favorites. It's probably my second favorite after I.O.U. Road Games would be my favorite if it was a full album, I guess. I'm not my favorite overall, but you know, those three are like, I just think they're absolute perfection. They're absolutely beautiful. The playing is insane. Allan is still exploring this same thing that he started with I.O.U. with the singer and the genre bending and the sort of non-stop, like, what the fuck am I listening to here? And that would continue on his next album too, but this time with a little twist, and that's, I'm always not sure how to say this, if it's meant to be a Tavakron or Atavakron, but let's say a Tavakron from 1986. So this album would mark the beginning of Holdsworth's deep dive into the syntax, which was like a guitar MIDI controller thing that he had. I don't think he had it built, but that he came across and that he found really compelling. He was really into, well, you know, all the DX7 sounds and shit like that. A lot of the stuff that people cringe the most about the 80s. And but you know, he found that he could do things with the syntax and create sound textures and stuff like that he just couldn't do on the guitar, of course. And so it was very attractive to him, and he became, you know, he adopted it into his set, and it became a major factor, and especially on that album, there's a lot of it on there. It's a fantastic album. There's some incredible compositions on that album. Like the opening track is one of Allan's best. It's just absolutely barnstorming, fiery, incredible playing and everything like that. Do I prefer hearing versions of those tracks from, you know, some of the live bootlegs and stuff when he's back to playing it on the guitar? Yes. I like the sound of the guitar much better than I like the sound of the syntax, but I do love that album, and I do listen to it quite a lot. So it's still up there for me. I still really like it. But it's a little diminished because I don't particularly love the sound of the synth axe. And is it on that album that he brings in a keyboard player? I can't remember. I think it's either that one or maybe the next one even. Let's have a look. Yeah, so it's on this album that he starts flirting with bringing in keyboards into the mix as well. But I think, what he found with the syntax and the keyboards, you're getting the same kind of textures mixing in, and you get a little bit of a loss of information there. And like that, those sounds didn't quite work that well together. This kind of thing would continue on with 1987's Sand. Another cool album, although it's probably the one I listen to the least out of all of them. Well, except for the last one. In 1989, he would put out the album Secrets, which was actually, I think, the first solo album of his that I heard. This is he would bring in the pianist Steve Hunt as to join the band and basically be a collaborator of his going forward and pretty much on everything else. I think he's on all the other albums. It was certainly part of his live band for many years. He's not on every album, but he's on a lot of stuff, and he was part of his live band for a lot of time as well. For me, this is really, as much as I love some of Secrets, this is really the point where I find that, Paul Williams is not singing on these last few albums. He's not on. There's no singing on Out of Akron or Sand. Is there any singing on Out of Akron? I can't remember. Atavachron? I don't know. There's definitely no on Sand. On Secrets, there's vocals, like female vocals on there. Oh, and I mean, there's the awesome Vinnie Colaiuta is on there. So I mean, that's really cool. I feel like going forward, Allan starts to repeat himself. Like from this point on, after Secrets. So after Secrets, you get Wardenclyffe Tower in 1992. You get Hard Hat Area in 1993. Great stuff. Both those albums are great. Of course, Wardenclyffe Tower has that Nikola Tesla wireless transmission tower album cover and sort of theme, but it's a loose theme, it's all instrumental. Hard Hat Area is really cool. It's a little bit, there's a little bit more of the, that album always reminds me of Secrets, like the more aggressive parts of Secrets, so I dig it for that. None Too Soon from 1996 was his attempt, or his he decided to do jazz standard interpretations with a longtime collaborator, Gordon Beck, who he had done a whole bunch of other great albums with as well, which I highly recommend checking out. Some very cool stuff there. And then in 2000, he'll put out what is, in my opinion, his last proper album as a solo artist, and that's the 16 Men of Tain. I mean, it was almost like a homage to his whiskey distillery in Scotland, which whatever. A lot of people love that album, and I think it's, look, don't get me wrong, I love all his albums. That's why I bought the box set, because I listened to all the albums. And sorry, I'll finish with the album. So, and in 2001, he released his last album, which was Flat Tire: Music for a Non-Existent Movie, which is just him doing, sort of movies, a lot of syntax and soundtrack. It just, I think I don't like that album. That's the one Allan Holdsworth solo album that I don't like. I don't think it's any good. I do love all those albums. I listen to them. I really like Wardenclyffe Tower. I really like Hard Hat Area. But for me, I think that once he got to Secrets, he wasn't no longer like, you knew what you were going to get from an Allan Holdsworth album. I feel like from that point onwards, there's no great mystery anymore. He wasn't really, and I think a lot of the problem was the fact that, on I.O.U. and in the early days, he was more about capturing live, spontaneous performances from the band. But as time went on, it was much more pieced together, much more people recording in separate studios, sending Allan the tracks, Allan sitting with albums for many, many months or even years, like redoing solos and redoing mixes and all of this sort of stuff. And it just takes away some of that rawness that was so compelling on I.O.U. and those first few albums. And I think also without having the singer there, it's sort of, the albums kind of lose focus a little bit. It just it gets a little bit too lost in the weeds or something like that. That being said, it sounds like I'm being really critical of albums. I love those albums, so don't get me wrong. You don't need to scream at me and say, what are you talking about? Those albums are great. And I get it that a lot of people like those albums because they don't have the singer on them. And I like them too. But I'm just saying that I think as far as like Allan as an innovator goes, that's where it sort of really stops. And then he's just kind of like doing the Allan Holdsworth thing, the thing that he established, he invented. And it's been now mimicked and copied by so many in the fusion world. Allan's legacy is so much deeper than I think a lot of people realize, and he influenced and touched so many musicians on such a fundamental level. He kind of changed the game, when you listen to modern day stuff, Allan's all over it. He's all over it. And the saddest part about it is that, Allan died in a pretty financially bad place and having to play pretty small gigs, not getting the recognition that he deserved as one of the great geniuses of modern jazz and jazz fusion, jazz rock, whatever genre you want to put him in. He's one of the great great musical geniuses of the 20th century, and, was completely overlooked in his lifetime by the masses. They didn't appreciate. He should have been playing to, big halls and auditoriums and stuff like that, at least to hundreds of people at a time, if not thousands of people, like John McLaughlin at the end of his career has been doing, And it's a great shame. And I think it's partly Allan's fault, just the fact that he was so obsessive about his musical, his artistic vision. That's, that it cost him commercially. It cost him the ability to have some stability in his life. And I guess there's a lesson to be learned there, you can learn the lesson that you can stick to your guns creatively and be remembered as this sort of uncompromising genius, or perhaps you can find a middle ground and allow some compromise, in the face of opportunity. That's the thing. I think that Allan could have still done something really artistically. He's such a musical genius. I think he could have done something creative and made money from UK or from, the Road Games era with Warner Brothers, with Eddie Van Halen. He could have done something still that was cool, You know, wouldn't have to go full sellout pop, but anyway, that's the way it turned out. Allan is, you know, I have a few favorite guitarists. Allan is right there at the top. John McLaughlin, Allan Holdsworth, Larry Coryell, Steve Hillage. I love Allan so much, and I wanted to make this video just to highlight what an incredible impact he's had on me and on the music world in general. And I just want to say, Allan, if you're up there and you hear us, thank you so much for all the incredible music and for your genius. You're much missed and much loved. Anyway, guys, I think that'll do it for today. Allan has I'll just say this, Allan has a whole shitload of great sideman albums that you should definitely explore. There's so much great stuff there. I raced through some of these later solo albums, and I gave you the reason why, but they're definitely also worth checking out, so go and do that. And, you know, keep Allan's music alive, because the guy was a genius. All right, guys, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for keeping Allan's memory alive, and I'll see you next time.